The most difficult subjects can be explained to the most slow-witted person if they have not formed any idea of them already. But the simplest thing cannot be made clear to the most intelligent person if they are firmly persuaded that they know already, without a shadow of doubt, what is laid before them. That was a little excerpt from The Kingdom of God is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. I'm just going to read one more little piece from David Whyte, excerpt from his poem, What to Remember When Waking, because it also feels really relevant and alive on the back of today's conversation. To be human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others. To remember the other world in this world is to live in your true inheritance. Yum-oh. Both of these pieces alluding to the numinous, the invisibilities, the intangibilities, the wordless wonder, the gift that for many indigenous and ancient cultures, and as we explore in this conversation today with Paul Austin, the gift of plant medicine in taking us to those places and allowing us to build a kind of familiarity with those places again. And this conversation with Paul Austin, who is the founder of Third Wave and also was involved in the founding of Synthesis Retreat in Amsterdam, a retreat center facilitating psilocybin retreats. We really explore the impact of, or really Paul's journey in normalizing and destigmatizing the use of psychedelics and plant medicine for growth and transformation, and Paul's mission to steward humanity 2.0 and really start to welcome back in reverent, responsible and effective use of psychedelics and plant medicine, so that we can again be in relationship and restore relationship to the whole, to the numinous aspects of what it means to be in this fleshly body as a human in an ecological web. And so we explore what microdosing might offer us, some of the science of microdosing, some of the ethics of microdosing, and how might we be reverent in our use of psychedelics and microdosing, so to avoid a kind of whitewashing, but also how it is important to speak the language of our culture in this time and to speak to the benefits of microdosing and psychedelics for productivity, creativity, flow, peak performance, but as a bridge to welcome in also maybe more of some of the transpersonal realms and not to leave them out. And so we explore, of course, living in paradox, as many of our conversations tend to bend towards, and what these experiences and these medicines might have as a way of teaching us and having us feel more familiar and graceful in living in paradox. It's a brilliant one. It's full of science and philosophy and humor and also practicalities around how might we microdose effectively, so that we don't just say we're going to microdose and have a really productive day and then end up, on our bed crying or staring into empty space, which, by the way, is not empty. So if you are already on your journey of being with and welcoming and honoring the gift of these medicines in your journey, or if you're just starting to open the gate and looking for more insight before you do go there, then this one is a great entrance point for you. But of course, before the episode, I just wish to really acknowledge that it is important that you do your research, that you surround yourself with people who can hold you in these experiences and afterwards as a form of integration. And then, of course, it's incredibly important to be very reverent and honoring and acknowledging of the deep lineage of these medicines in our Indigenous cultures and the real sensitivity that is asked of us when starting to enter these spaces, so that we can not only allow them to gift us creativity and flow and performance, but also the deep humility of what it really means to be in relationship to something more than ourselves. Enjoy. Grab a tea, take a breath, notice the inhale, the exhale, and the space between. A moment in between moments. Here you are. You're listening to Spaces Between with your friend and host, L. Jeffrey. An open exploration into restoring connection in the 21st century in our personal lives, our relations, and our communities. What does it mean to live in relationship to the wholeness of who we are together? I'm not one for ads and am one for creating something beautiful with others, in this case, you. So if you enjoy our time together, I do invite you to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, rate and leave a review for the show. And if you're feeling super generous and fueled and filled up by our conversations, you might even consider donating or soon joining my Patreon membership. Just visit www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com, where you'll also find show notes and other useful links and resources following these conversations. So this is it. Let's dive in. All right, Paul, thank you for joining for an evening conversation for you, an early morning convo for me. Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to drop in.
Yeah, thanks, Al, for making this happen to explore the space between, as you were saying, paradox and psychedelics and microdosing and a number of other beautiful things.
Yeah, wherever else we end up. We connected originally, I think a couple of years ago, through a mutual brother, Martine, at the time, from High Existence and now Synthesis. Mm-hmm. And it's just been so beautiful watching from across the waters and winds, of course, both of your work in this space. So I look forward to diving in to, as you call it, stewarding humanity 2.0. What does that look and feel like? How might we get there? And yeah, I suppose I'm just super curious about the philosophy, the science of psychedelic use in plant medicine, but also practically and ethically and reverently, how do we go about actually practicing? But would you be open to a quick check-in before we dive into all of that juicy stuff?
Absolutely.
Cool. And for those listening, of course, feel free to take this as an invitation just to take a moment. It might be the first time you've intentionally closed your eyes and notice where the breath shows up in your body. So just taking a couple of breaths. And then just, either of us will just check in how we're feeling physically and emotionally.
Physically, I feel very soft and grounded and present. And emotionally, I feel a little conflicted, a little anxious, but also grateful and like curious about what we'll explore.
Physically, I'm feeling quite high energy now. It's been a quick turnaround from getting up to showing up here. So I'm feeling quite jazzed, very mobile in the hips and the neck. Emotionally, also feeling really excited. I think your velour hoodie really got me going. And just super grateful to be here in conversation, and already before we clicked record, just felt such a nice flow between us. So super grateful and excited for what emerges. Yeah, as a way for, I suppose, situating or contextualizing our conversation, would you be open to just painting a picture verbally of where you're joining us from?
My childhood bedroom, of all places. Right? It's a little sparse and but clean. It has just like a very nostalgic energy to it. You know, having spent my first 18 to 20 years, and this is sort of, in a way, the home I come back to, because I haven't really found a new home at this point. I've gypsied for most of my 20s. I'm now 30. And there's a few fun objects around, a couple that I got in Oaxaca, a painting behind me that I got in Nepal, a little artistic thing that I got in Tanzania. So there's a few reminders as well of those travels. But it's a space that I love.
Yeah. And is this quite a pivotal space in terms of your relationship with psychedelia and psychedelics?
I mean, in some ways, it's home. You know, it's what grounds me. It's what creates the capacity for me to have gone out into the world as I've gone out and sort of live and travel and play in a very dynamic way. So I think there's that sort of like center of gravity that I keep coming back to here. That reminds me of who I am and where I'm from, and so sort of those more profound existential or deep things, whatever.
Mm. Yeah, it's kind of the dual pull of sometimes I can experience it as a kind of sense of regression, being pulled back to those years, and sometimes just a beautiful grace and gratitude of, wow, I've come so far and remember those times.
Yeah, like walk around the neighborhood and I go, I remember that, and like, oh, I got in a fight there and played with, went and hung out with my friend here in my elementary school, or so. It's kind of like you can kind of have those external points of reference that that will always be there, that aren't going anywhere. And I think that's the grounding part is, for those of us who are more, I don't even know if it's professionally inclined necessarily, but those of us who are curious about the external world, who do want to explore and want to go on adventures, sometimes those explorations and those adventures can leave us feeling very in the air, up in the clouds, very much kind of out of our bodies sometimes. And so to come here and to ground and to remember the humanity, the physical form in which we're in is, I think, it's a fundamental reminder of our humanness, which is critical.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Would you mind sharing a little about your personal journey through time and space, from your early days, maybe higher dose journeys, and really welcome you into this world, and then was it a 7-month microdose protocol into now? Just what was your kind of journey of revelations and rememberings that brought you to doing the work that you do?
Yeah, it's like a decade-long trajectory. So I'll do my best to pinpoint the important moments. Where I grew up, where I am now is in West Michigan in the United States. It's a more, I would say, traditional part of the States. Family oriented, fairly religious, very kind people, community oriented. And there was always a part of me that felt, loved and seen in that, especially by my more immediate family, but also a more distinct part of me that felt not really seen and not totally accepted and not totally welcomed, because I've always been a little bit more of a rabble rouser, a little bit more of a heretic, sort of very independent in terms of how I approach life. So when I first started working with psychedelics, I was 19. It's about 10 and a half years ago, almost 11 years ago now. And through those early psychedelic experiences, just sort of release a lot of the shame that I had internalized growing up in terms of being a very sort of independent rabble rouser person in a much more sort of conventional culture, if you will. So was able to release a lot of that shame and sort of go inwards and tap into my own sense of truth and my own sense of what it is that I wanted to create with my existence. And from those early experiences, made the commitment and the decision that it would be best to spend my 20s, the decade ahead, expanding through curiosity, expanding through travel, expanding through difficulty and struggle, expanding through taking big risks that might not always pay off, understanding that the fundamental value that I learned from psychedelic experiences was that material goods and sort of the more traditional rat race or corporate way of living there was a ceiling there, and basically I had already poked through that ceiling. I'd already seen on the other side of that and realized that the promises of that lifestyle were in many ways empty for someone like myself. That's not necessarily the case for everyone, but for someone like me, it was not the path that I wanted to follow. And through those early experiences, I sort of came to trust myself in following a much more unconventional path, largely because when you do psychedelics, you realize that death is an illusion, and that much of our fear of, oh, can we actually do that, comes from a fear of death. It comes from a fear of, we're not good enough. It comes from, it's a very, very sort of deep thing. So when you go through these high dose psychedelic experiences, you come to realize that there's really nothing preventing an individual from creating an existence, any existence in which they want to live. So, one thing led to another. I spent a year teaching English in Turkey and taught myself how to build an online business. After Turkey, moved to Thailand, where I lived in Chiang Mai for about a year and built my first online business, which was an online. I taught English online. I built a school online, and at that point, I started to microdose because I had heard about microdosing on a podcast, and sort of thought back to those early psychedelic trips that I had, which, oftentimes for the week or 2 weeks after a high dose psychedelic experience, I would feel much more connected to myself, connected to my family, connected to my friends. There was a sense that I made better decisions about the diet and the food that I ate, about how I exercised, about how I treated myself. It was much easier to spend time in meditation, to spend time in stillness and quiet. And for that reason, I just felt like life was a little bit more flowy and a little bit more easygoing. And so when I heard about microdosing, I thought, hey, that sounds like a really interesting way to elongate that afterglow, right? So normally the afterglow lasts, let's say, 1 to 2 weeks with a high dose trip. But with microdosing, it seemed like an opportunity to extend that much farther. So I experimented with LSD 2 times a week for about 7 months. And I had 2 core intentions. One was to minimize resistance to flow, to spend more time in flow as I was building that initial business. And the other thing is, for most of my life, I've struggled with some degree of social anxiety. And in late high school and college, I covered that up with alcohol and then cannabis. And through microdosing, I found sort of a way out of at least alcohol. So I was also interested in microdosing LSD to minimize alcohol consumption and to use another substance and sort of experiment with that. And it was tremendously successful. It went really well. And after that experience, or even during that experience, I launched Third Wave as a platform. In looking at the space as it was back in 2015, this was, so more than 5 years ago, there really was an essential resource available that presented psychedelics in a more sort of modern branding and aesthetic. I really thought there's so much stigma that's still around psychedelic substances. And I had been getting deep into like the research and the literature and just reading everything that I could get my hands on, and came to realize that, one, we as humans have an incredible history with these substances. We've been using them for thousands of years. And 2, there was actually a ton of research that was published about LSD and psilocybin in the 50s and 60s that showed that it was incredibly effective at treating a range of conditions. So I kind of came upon that and was like, it makes no sense to me why these substances are heavily stigmatized, are illegal, and like why people think they're harmful, because for the most part, they're not. And so it sort of like set me on this sort of path of, well, what can I do in my power to inform and educate as many people as possible to help facilitate their own journey of awareness and healing and like consciousness. And kind of the big cherry on top of that was, in those early psychedelic trips, I think, the one of the core truths that we learn from that is our interconnectivity to everything around us. How, thou art that, we are everything around us. And we are facing an ecological crisis. And so I was also somewhat motivated by what is the quickest way to facilitate and catalyze an evolution in consciousness. And the answer that kept coming back was, these medicines are incredibly powerful and can do it in a really, really short period of time. They wake people up. And so one thing led to another. I just kept pursuing that path and that path. I continued building Third Wave. And then in 2018, with our mutual friend Martijn, we launched Synthesis in the Netherlands and started doing high dose psilocybin retreats for people. This is right before Michael Pollan's book came out in 2018, and was involved with Synthesis for about a year and helped to get that up and going. And then ever since then, for about the last 18 months, have just fully focused on Third Wave and building the team for Third Wave. And sort of Third Wave in itself is undergoing an evolution where, we did what was legal, which was education and content. And we created a course. And now as this space and this ecosystem develops, we're just creating a platform so that every person who sort of starts to work with psychedelic substances can do so in a way that's intentional and responsible, and that leads to tangible change in their way of being.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing the work that you do and for sharing. I resonate with so much of your story, the piece around, I suppose, unlocking or I suppose for me, it was bringing shame to the surface, my first psychedelic experiences, and which were very much around my sexuality. And I'd hide behind my work and being so busy to avoid the pain of being queer in a straight world. And yeah, it was psychedelics and plant medicine that really held me in a very confronting way, but with so much grace and I suppose allowed so much compassion for myself as well in unlocking that shame and in helping me actually come to accept that there is another way. I'm not wrong here. And I don't have to hold the identity of being wrong or being other. And then actually, yeah, we actually all belong. And this isn't a question about our belonging to each other. This is just a question around the psyche and culture and things that are actually quite malleable and can be changed. So it afforded, I suppose, a real spaciousness in my way of being in the world, which I'm ever so grateful for.
And then through that space, you can start to, you're not really creating a new identity, but you're letting go of all those parts of yourself that you thought were yours, that are not. And then in that stripping away, you come to closer and closer to that pure essence of who you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's sort of what life is about. It's stripping away all the stuff that isn't ours.
And in actual fact, for me, seeing identity as a fun theater show, like I just hold identity more lightly and maybe place more emphasis on character over identity, and character being maybe that kind of effervescent essence within and all around. And identity is, persona, the mask, is just this game that we get to put on, and it can actually be quite enjoyable. If you're into theater and improv, go for it. Show up as a different human every single person I meet. But I'm curious, when you say stewarding humanity 2.0, and you mentioned the ecological crises and interconnectedness, do you have a sense what does that look and feel like? Like, what is the aspiration in terms of, stewarding humanity 2.0? Or what does a world that is, restored in its regenerative nature and wholeness feel like for you?
I think that, the first fundamental truth to that is recognizing the interconnectedness in everything, right? I love Charles Eisenstein, and the way that he puts it is we've been living in this world of disconnection, this world of thinking that we are separate, this world of extractivism, and the fundamental truth that psychedelics wake you up to is that you are interconnected. And so what would it look like to then create more systems, right? Like whether that's in business, whether that's in politics, whether that's in, the way that we govern, whether that's our relationship to our food, but where we're in relationship with things and we're not so disconnected. Because I think one core element of industrialism, which is what we're starting to transition out of and have been transitioning out of since the second wave of psychedelics, is industrialism to succeed requires separation, requires disconnection. It requires a producer and a consumer. It requires, for many, many years, the men to work outside the home. It requires childcare to be sold instead of it just being part of sort of the community wealth that we have. So I think that's sort of like one fundamental aspect, and that's more philosophical. I think when it gets down into like more practical things, I would see it from a few perspectives, and these are perspectives that I'm very aware of. There are many, many perspectives on this. One book that I will point your listeners to if they want to get deep into it is a book called, coincidentally enough, The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler, who was a futurist who also wrote Future Shock, and there was one other. He wrote a trilogy. And he wrote The Third Wave in 1980, discussing the transition from the industrial era. Discussing the transition from the agricultural era, which we lived in for 10,000 years, into the industrial era, which sort of happened with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, into this third wave. Some call it the information era. Some people call it the mycelial era. Some people call it the era of, like Charles Eisenstein, the era of connection and coming together and interconnectivity. And so what I see sort of my personal role in is looking at how businesses embody interconnectivity, how businesses embody collaboration. What are we doing to step outside of the sort of narrow viewpoint of competition and recognizing that in creating this post-industrial world that we need to live in, that there's no need to compete because we're all sharing resources and we're all sharing an earth and we're all sharing a similar vision and goal, that where we're going as a human species is for every human alive to have their basic physiological needs taken care of, right? To be able to pursue higher truth and meaning, to be able to pursue some sort of creative act, right? Most people, although for the most part, slavery has been done away with, it still exists, but for the most part, it's been done away with. There's a new form of slavery, and that's for a lot of people, work and jobs and feeling like, to just survive, they need to spend 40 or 50 hours of their week being miserable. And so I think this sort of evolution of humanity is, how do we help people feel as free as possible? How do we help people take care of their basic physiological needs? How can we do that by reframing business? So both, what types of jobs are we offering people? How do we help them feel more motivated and feel like they're more purpose driven and they find meaning in the work that they do? And then also within that are things like UBI, having a universal basic income. What will automation do? What will artificial intelligence do? So there are a few sort of things that are running around in there. Now, I think that the core truth to come back to, and the core thing that I'm interested in then, is what role do psychedelics play in catalyzing that evolution in a much quicker way, right? In accelerating that pace of evolution. And I think fundamentally what psychedelics have the capacity to do is, as we already mentioned, recognizing the truth of our interconnectivity, right? Recognizing how fundamental that is to our sense of well-being. And then as we recognize that truth, taking care of the things around us to reflect the way that we want to treat ourselves. So that's as simple as your physical space and keeping it clean. It could be the relationships that you choose to engage with. It could be the work that you choose to engage with. But having some sense of harmony, having some sense of flow, right? The Tao, having some sense of, this feels like it's moving, it's aligned, it's healthy, right? Like, how can we bring more and more of that into our everyday waking life? So we don't feel like there's so much resistance. We don't feel like we need to suffer. We don't feel like we're forcing anything, but that we're able to simply surrender and trust that the path that we're on is the path that we're meant to be on. And I think psychedelics help us to do that, as they give us the courage to trust that deeper knowing, to trust that deeper part of ourselves, and to trust that it will pan out as long as you treat yourself well, and as long as you treat, the things and the people and the animals and the earth around you well.
Yes, to all of that. And I would add, which, I suppose is noted in recognizing relationship and reciprocity between our inner world and outer world, and by caring for that around us in the same way that we care for that within us. Yeah, we are recognizing, living in reciprocity, but that, taking care of our core physical needs within the bounds of our ecological abilities, or the abilities of our earthly resources to hold that. So recognizing the bounds of our ecologies, and within that, really doing as much as we can to make sure that all human animals have the ability to evolve, to transcend, to do the self-actualizing work. I think something that we touched on before I clicked record as well is the notion of paradox. And as you spoke about, I think it was, I can't remember exactly what you spoke about, but it basically, for me, psychedelics have really taught me the fact that I am also an individual. I am an individual that's incredibly powerful and scared, like to a scary degree, and powerful because at one and the same time, I am also everything. I'm a transcendent and immanent being. I am embodied and deeply embedded. And straddling that is incredibly difficult and maybe impossible with just the faculties of the mind. Like for me, the embodied kind of grit and knowing and resilience that such journeys have gifted me, or maybe just awoken within me again, have been incredibly useful in navigating this paradox between being an independent self who does have my own gifts and strengths that I've developed over the years, and at the same time being in relationship and learning to be dependent on all things and all people. I wonder if you could share a little bit about paradox as we did in the beginning, and how psychedelics might support us in straddling paradox a little more gracefully. Big questions. Deep breaths.
These are big questions. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll go back to what we were discussing before we hit record, which was, so I'm reading this book, The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant, which essentially tracks the evolution of Western philosophy in particular, from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle to Francis Bacon to Voltaire to, I think I'm reading Schopenhauer right now, to Nietzsche to beyond that, right? And there's a line that he wrote in there, which I think I was reading earlier today, which said something along the lines of what a lot of these philosophers are doing, and what most philosophers are doing, is we're trying to understand sort of absolute truth. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, all of the ways that we talk about it are just we're dressing truth in different garments, right? And so we're just placing different clothes in it. So Schopenhauer has his philosophy about the will. Kant might talk about his philosophy in terms of critiquing reason. Plato talked about his philosophy, whatever it was. But we're still just kind of circling and dancing around that paradox, because ultimately that paradox it's a void. It's a place of mystery. It's a place of non-existence. It's a place of emptiness and silence and nothingness, right? And especially high dose psychedelic experiences, for those of us who have done them on multiple occasions, or even for those of us who have maybe only done them once or twice, there's a high likelihood that we've entered that void to some degree, that we've gone into that void, that we've basically obliterated our ego, that we've eliminated, the sort of mind chatter, and we've allowed the divine within to be seen and to fully come alive. Aldous Huxley, who's a well-known author, mostly for writing Brave New World. But what a lot of people don't know is he was a mystic and a phenomenal philosopher, and wrote in the later part of his life a lot about the perennial philosophy. He wrote a lot about Vedanta. He wrote a lot about psychedelics towards the end of his life. And, one thing he talks about is how for the self with a capital S to fully come alive, for us to, it's basically like we just have to get things out of the way. The ego, the small s, is eclipsing it. It's just blocking it. It's like a moon in front of the sun that wants to shine through. And so what psychedelics do is they get all of that out of the way, right? They allow the void to be fully seen. They allow the divine within to be fully amplified. And in recognizing that and kind of going with that, we come to recognize our divinity. Mm. As you were saying, the fact that we can create anything that it is that we want to create. And also in that process, we are also responsible for everything that it is that we create. So while there's absolute freedom in that creation, there's also the obligation to come from a place of absolute purity. Because if anything comes from shadow in that place of creation, it could be perceived as evil, or it could significantly harm people, or it could, et cetera, et cetera. So psychedelics help to cleanse that void, right? They help to cleanse the doors of perception, is what Huxley would say. And then when we enter those states, when we become familiar with those states, I think the challenging part for a lot of people, and I'm sure you've seen this in certain circles that are really plant medicine oriented, is people forget that the psychedelics are just an amplifier, and people actually end up giving up their power to the psychedelic or to the guru. But in this case, the guru sometimes is mushrooms. And I think the key to remember, and what I've even been remembering lately with the help of a coach, is to think of psychedelics like Dumbo's feather, right? And plant medicine's like Dumbo's feather, right? Like Dumbo thought that the only reason that he could fly was because he had a feather. And then what he learned is even when that feather was taken away, he actually could still fly. It was no problem at all. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes psychedelics are that opening, they're that catalyst, they're that thing that help us to recognize our divinity initially, they're that thing that help us to come awake for the first time. But after we wake up there's absolutely room to dip back into the well from time to time, no doubt. And it's sort of incumbent upon us as divine beings to keep those doors of perception cleansed with meditation and breath work and time in nature and connection with other humans, right? We need to continue to purify from the toxicity of especially our modern lifestyle. And I think when I talk about stewarding humanity 2.0, one of the sort of things that I'm interested in is how do we create ecosystems that are pure enough where we can just exist as divine beings and not need to worry about dipping back into the profane elements of life and existence. Right. So fundamentally, I think what we're experiencing with a lot of people is they're going and purchasing land in Costa Rica. You might know Ian Michael. Do you know Ian Michael?
No.
That name ring a bell? Okay. So forget I said that. So there are people who are buying land in Costa Rica, who are buying islands, who are buying land in British Columbia, and they're saying, let's start these intentional communities. Let's start these spaces in nature that are regenerative, that have this element of reciprocity, where we grow our own food, where we host our own events, where we do plant medicine retreats, where we create spaces for people to simply be, where they don't feel this sort of obligation to participate in a system that is killing us both externally and internally. And I think when people come to that truth through psychedelics, when they come to when they get in touch with that divinity within, the integration process then becomes so much easier if the space that you're going back into is also pure and clean. But the challenge is for almost everyone, the spaces that we're going back into are not. Various reasons. It could be because of the food that we're eating. It could be because of the relationships that we're in. It could be because of the work that we do. And a big part of that healing process is purifying all of those parts so that they resonate fully, so that there's a sense of harmony between us and the external thing, whatever that thing is.
Yeah, I love that. The building the coherence between who, after say a journey, we've now come to know ourselves as, and then rocking up in a culture that, for many of us, and I remember in my first early years of journeying, a culture that is so radically different. And now, unfortunately, I feel in the wrong. I feel guilty. I feel like I've done something illegal. And I just have to shove all of that away. Yet it felt so sacred, and it was. And so the importance of finding communities or building communities for us to, and I mean, this is all my work as well, reweaving wholeness in self and society. And it must be both. We swim in culture and we catch culture. And so if we catch a moment of the sacred, how can we weave that back into culture so that we are in coherence with the world around us? But I remember for me, and this is why I just have so much respect for the work that you do, destigmatizing these experiences. But coming out of such an experience, in the beginning, there's so much fear in talking about it to weave it into my relationships because, it's heavily stigmatized. And I might be seen as being kooky or being woo or, losing touch with reality. And it just makes me feel even more incredibly alone in my profound experience. And so,
which you are totally alone, right? In some ways,
yeah,
and we're also not, right? And that's the paradox of psychedelics. Yeah, that is the paradox.
Exactly. It is no one will know my experience. So I am, very imminently alone. But I'm wondering for you, how, say you're at a conference and you know that, maybe there's not so much openness around psychedelia just yet. What is your kind of elevator, not pitch, but explainer? How do you bridge that world, and how do you, conversationally, maybe destigmatize the space that you're in? Obviously, it's very contextual, but how might one safely open up the conversation?
So I'll kind of separate that into two parts, right? There's the first part, there's business.
Yeah.
And then on the second hand, there's maybe just more sort of everyday family or friends that I catch up with, or non-business conferences, we could say, because a lot of the more conferencey stuff that I've done has been talking about microdosing at non-psychedelic conferences, right? And so the way that I often approach it at those conferences, South by Southwest was one. There's another one in Switzerland that Stephen Kotler was speaking out about flow. It was sort of like a Trend Day conference. I spoke at the Next Web, which is a tech conference in Amsterdam. This is a few years ago now. And oftentimes the way that I talked about it was microdosing in particular is anti-addictive. Microdosing is sub-perceptible, so you don't trip at all. Microdosing can help. It has these benefits. It can help with flow. It can help with creativity. It can help with decision making. And Steve Jobs said LSD was actually one of the most impactful things that he did. And actually, like Elon Musk does psychedelics right now. And like there's a bunch of other, like Tim Ferriss said, all the billionaires that he knows do psychedelics on a regular basis. Right. So I sort of take some fundamental things like they're anti-addictive. Oh, I didn't know that. I thought all legal drugs were addictive and harmful. No, they have these benefits. Oh, interesting. And then I sort of allude to, and all these really productive, incredible people actually use psychedelics to help with their creativity. So that's more of the business kind of like influencer angle, I would say. Whereas the elevator pitch for a more sort of general audience is I track a few things. First, cannabis. So I often lead with cannabis. Oh, like how cannabis used to be illegal and now it's like recreational in 15 states. So the like psychedelics are undergoing a somewhat similar trajectory where we used to think they were bad, and now there's all this research showing that they're actually really healthy and they're really beneficial, and especially for clinical health conditions, they're really beneficial. And that's often what I've emphasized time and time again is, the way that psychedelics are coming back to the forefront is for treatment-resistant depression and for major depressive disorder and for PTSD and for alcoholism and for end-of-life anxiety, for OCD, for all of these clinical conditions that we've had absolutely no innovations, no significant innovations in for the last 50 years. And these people are struggling. And these people are committing suicide. And these people need help. And it looks like psychedelics can finally do that and help them with that. And we have all this clinical research and et cetera, et cetera. So that's usually the more for the more sort of average everyday listener, if you will. That's the lens through which I like to view it is cannabis, mental health, medical health. And then the final thing is this is why I focus so much publicly on microdosing is microdosing as a concept it's not inherently, It's not inherently threatening to the ego. Right. So if you talk about high doses, if you talk about doing a bunch of mushrooms, if you talk about losing your mind, right, the ego has sort of a natural reflex to say, I don't want any of that, like, no thanks. I'm good here. Even if they're not, I'm good here. Whereas microdosing is sort of like a sleeper cell for psychedelics. It's something that sort of gets its nose under the hood and starts to kind of like, I actually I'm seeing a lot of benefits from this. I'm feeling more energy. I'm feeling more centered. It's making my meditation practice easier because of microdosing. I'm weaning off Adderall and Ritalin, or I'm weaning off Prozac or Zoloft, or I'm weaning off, my anti-anxiety medications, whatever it is. And I'm working with something that's a plant, that's much healthier, that's not addictive. And it feels much better. So I think there's also that sort of personal angle where microdosing is a really good lead in for those for people who are more, we could say, like psychedelic naive.
Yeah. And I love the, I suppose it's a very just strategic approach to destigmatizing plant medicine and psychedelics. But I wonder about, and just your perspective on the potential, and as we bridge worlds and start to, I suppose, reintegrate practices that are and can be very profound and mystical and transcendental in many ways, but in a culture that really doesn't hold much space for that. We need to speak their language and meet them where they are. But how do we still hold reverence and, I suppose, acknowledge the deep profundity of these medicines, and acknowledge the lineage as well? And to what degree is microdosing, I suppose, a whitewashing of such profound medicines that have been used for centuries? How do you hold that in your own working and living philosophy?
Well, I think, one thing to note is microdosing is the way that these medicines were most commonly used. So it was so interesting. I did a panel with Hamilton Morris a few years ago, the guy from Vice. And it was about microdosing. And the first question and the first thing that he led with, which was even surprising to me, was, actually like the way that the Bwiti used iboga, the way that the Mazatec used psilocybin, the way that even ayahuasca has been most commonly used in the Amazon is more in like microdose levels, where it's sort of like a nice lift, or it helps with sickness, or it helps with visual acuity in the forest as hunting, right? And these sort of higher ceremonial doses were reserved for very special occasions, right? Like even in the in ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries that Plato and Aristotle and pretty much every major Greek thinker, philosopher, person participated in, they only did the greater mysteries one time in their life, and then they had the lesser mysteries, I think every 4 years it was. So I think there's a role for both microdosing in terms of the everyday things, in terms of just helping us to have a little bit more energy or feel a little bit more clarity or just get in touch with ourselves a little bit better. And there's also the role for the much more sort of sacred, ceremonial, deep dives into consciousness. And the downside, if you will, is so much of our culture, vast majority of our culture is so distant from that sacredness that we have to get clever about how do we build steps for them to go from here to there, right? How do we bridge the gap? How do we build bridges, right? And I think that's like if someone is on sort of in their traditional medical model and they've been depressed for 20 years and they've been on pharmaceuticals for 20 years, and you tell them that what they need to do is to go to the Amazon to heal with Mother Ayahuasca, to be in touch with that sacred reverence and sort of use some of these more, we could say, new agey terms. I think there are a few people, and have been several people who will do that, but I think the vast majority of people will have and have had some sort of skepticism. So I think it's critical then, like, how do you communicate? Like the ones who are willing to do anything, like they'll do it. The ones who have had deep issues, they'll usually be willing to try anything because suicide could be a potential next option. But for the vast majority of people who could benefit from these medicines still, I'm really curious about how we bridge that gap between the modern industrial profane lifestyle and this lifestyle of reciprocity, sacred reciprocity, reverence, recognizing the lineage of these important medicines, because that's even a huge critique of the modern psychedelic movement, where like there's gatekeepers. The only people who can be therapists are those who have gotten a 4-year degree and done X, Y, and Z. Are the only people who can hold space. You have to be a psychiatrist. You have to have all these sort of Western credentials to be able to work with these medicines that are fundamentally not meant for institutions. They're fundamentally not meant for clinics. That are fundamentally not meant to be in a room for, of all things, So I think, how do you balance sort of the how tame we are? How do you balance that with how wild we want to be and how wild psychedelics can make us? And I think that's again, getting back to that theme of stewarding humanity 2.0. I think in many ways that humanity 2.0 is helping humanity get back in touch with its wildness, because it's been domesticated out of us. Yeah. We are domesticated. We are incredibly domesticated. And in becoming so domesticated over the last 10,000 years, really ever since the advent of the agricultural era, but especially now in the industrial era, ever since we've been domesticated, we're now, it's becoming worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. We can't adapt because biologically we're not meant to live lives like this. So I think what psychedelics can also help us do is to rewild, is to get back in touch with that wildness. And hopefully then in that awakening process that we realize more and more like, oh, these medicines are not to be contained. These medicines are not to be necessarily contained to an institution or a clinic or whatever it is, but they're meant to be wild. They're meant to be used outdoors. They're meant to be used in sacred ceremonies. They're meant to be used for healing the deep existential suffering that so many of us are currently facing. And so I think it's just a matter of like patience and time, and like we'll get there, and it's probably like 100-year path to get there. But like first, let's get people off pharmaceuticals and antidepressants, and first let's help people feel a little bit better, and then step by step we can get them deeper and deeper into that reciprocity, essentially.
Yeah, and it really is about just building the trust with the medicine or with the psychedelics. Those who may have a great deal of skepticism if we do maybe sell it through more of the You'll have a mystical experience which will help you feel connected to all things, and your fear of death will diminish almost entirely. And yeah, for those who that doesn't work, having a direct experience in a very light dose will help guide them, and from within, and maybe even completely without words, and they may not even be able to talk about it, but they'll have the sense and the trust that these medicines can carry them places, and they can trust in that. And it's Martin and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about the kind of empiricism of psychedelic use, and more so in the therapeutic space, but coming at it from a very diagnostic perspective, that we're still pathologizing and seeing that it will solve this problem and that problem, and we're measuring its success based on its ability to support certain ailments, and has very little space for the transpersonal realm or the mystical realm. And so how do we still bridge worlds and acknowledge that, yes, in order to safely, I suppose, ease our culture in a direction that enables us to be with these medicines, but at the same time hold space and reverence for the transpersonal realm, so that when culture is ready to accept that, it's still there, and we haven't completely put that aside just to make it feel safe.
Well, and it's there already, right? Like, and it's accessible already. So I think in large part, we're talking about the degree of accessibility and the sort of like a more abstract concept of the percentage of humans who have accessed those realms and those states of being, and who are willing to access those realms and those states of being. And, you know, I go back to Ken Wilber and his work, and I was reading one of his books a couple of years ago where he talked about it. We don't need everyone to wake up. We don't need everyone to access these transpersonal realms. In fact, the vast majority of people are probably better off not going there if we look at culture and society as a whole. But the point that he made was, he sort of made a comparison to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, where because of the printing press, you know, it wasn't everyone who became literate. It was the top 10% of people who became literate. It was those, you know, the intelligentsia, those who could access it. And because the top 10%, you know, had access to the printing press, had access to reading, had access to that higher level of education, those 10% then created all the new systems in which naturally just everyone else gravitated into that sense of being, right? Into the like the industrial literacy, the industrial world that we now live in. And so Wilber was making he was making a comparison to, like, we don't need everyone to wake up. We don't need everyone to access this higher state of consciousness, but we do need like a solid minority. We need that 10% of people who are responsible for building all the systems in which humanity lives to have that awakening. And then through that process, they will be influenced in creating these systems of interconnectivity to steward humanity 2.0. And that's where I think, and that's kind of, again, goes back to, you know, Third Wave as a platform is for the general public, but a lot of the work that I'm specifically focused on is that intersection of psychedelics and business, because I think the capacity that business has is to shift things in a very short period of time, and to help us actually create these new systems of interconnectivity that are mindful of all the different incentives that go into building a new system. Right. And so I think the sort of the magic touch point of all of this is, again, how do we change the way that we do business? How do we change how do we help the souls of people in business to evolve through psychedelic medicine, so they recognize the fundamental truth of interconnectivity, and then they integrate that into everything that they're doing? I think Elon Musk is probably the best example of that. I don't think he's necessarily the ideal one, but I think he's sort of the granddaddy right now of that new emergent regenerative ecosystem that we're interested in building. And I have a sense that the psychedelic industry will, as a whole, will sort of act as that amplifier for all of culture in terms of like ushering in a new way that we do business. And the psychedelic industry has a phenomenal opportunity to embody principles of interconnectivity as it relates to doing business.
Yeah. Shifting gear a little, just in a few minutes, but practically, and I know obviously I recommend everyone to head to Third Wave and to do your becoming superhuman? Yeah, of course. But your 101, just in a couple of minutes, microdosing. How would you suggest either those who are, because I know for me, early days, oh, I'm going to microdose and have a really productive day. 20 minutes later, stuck to the bed.
Yeah.
So what are your, for either those starting out or those wanting to refine maybe their practice of microdosing, let's say with either, psilocybin or LSD, what are your, I suppose, the key things that you notice have the biggest or the most profound or leveraged impact on one's experience?
So the lens through which to view microdosing, and I would say all psychedelic use, is a skill. So just like you can develop the skill of a martial art or the skill of writing or the skill of running a business, you can also develop the skill of microdosing or the skill of psychedelic use. And so when it comes to, let's say, the skill of microdosing, there are like three critical elements, right? One is the type of medicine that you're using, whether it's LSD or psilocybin, or some people microdose with iboga or San Pedro, but most people it's LSD or psilocybin. The amount that you're taking. So for psilocybin, that's usually 100 milligrams to 500 milligrams. For LSD, that's anywhere from 5 micrograms to 20 micrograms. And then the intensity. I'm sorry, not the intensity, the frequency, right? So whether you're doing it once a week or 2 times a week or 3 times a week or 4 times a week. So I would say that's sort of like the flow chart, if you will, of microdosing as a skill, right? Be mindful of the medicine you're using, be mindful of the amount that you're taking, and be mindful of how often you're doing it. And so just for a little more nuance in each one of those, LSD is more dopaminergic. So more dopamine is created with LSD. So if you're interested in more creative flow, external brainstorming, hiking, LSD is usually better for that. Psilocybin is usually better for things that are related to emotional processing, that are related to feeling more, that are related to emotional clearing, right? Psilocybin is often better for that. If someone struggles with anxiety, microdose of psilocybin, don't go with LSD. LSD will usually amplify anxiety to some degree. If someone is more depressed, go with LSD. LSD is better for more depressive states. So that's a little bit of nuance about those two. In terms of the amount, right? So always start low and go slow is what we teach. So you like you said, you don't want to like overshoot and then sort of end up on a bed or giggling all day or just totally out of it, so it's much better to undershoot, to start low and go slow and then eventually calibrate, right? And what you're searching for with the amount that you're taking is you're looking for like kind of like what's the minimum effective dose and what's the range of that. So what's the difference between microdosing 0.1 grams of psilocybin and 0.2 grams of psilocybin? Or what's the difference between microdosing 5 micrograms of LSD and 15 micrograms of LSD? And what we've learned is the more you microdose, the more you have to balance that microdose with a mindfulness practice. So if you're planning to, for example, up your microdose level from 0.1 gram to 0.2 grams, you should also double how much you're meditating, right? Because as the sort of what happens when we microdose is this process of decompartmentalization. There's more chaos. There's more entropy in the brain because that's where the creativity comes from. So to keep that chaos and the entropy centered, you have to discipline the mind. You have to sit with the mind. You have to be able to sit with it. One other thing about sort of the amount, it also depends on your intention for the day. So if you want to just enter a state of flow and you're doing a little creative writing, probably go on the lower side. If you're looking to spend the time outside hiking and have some creative brainstorming with a business partner, maybe go up on a little bit the higher side. If you're looking to see a therapist or work with a coach, do some emotional stuff, maybe go up a little bit on the higher side, right? So that the amount that you're taking is also informed by your intention for that microdosing day. And then the last one is frequency. And sort of the fundamental way to start is do it 2 or 3 times per week for at least a month, right? And don't necessarily pay attention to how you feel the exact day that you microdose. What's much more important is the trajectory of your change from day 1 to day 30. It's similar to meditation, right? You're not going to just meditate on a single day and go, oh shit, I don't feel any different. Like this doesn't work. I'm not meditating anymore. When you meditate, you give it at least 30 days, hopefully, of consistent meditation to start to train the mind. Microdosing is similar. You want to give it at least 30 days, 2 or 3 times per week. Always leave, at least initially, a day in between your microdoses because there's short-term tolerance in psychedelics. So if you microdose 2 days in a row, the same amount, the second day, it's not going to have the same sort of juice as it would if you gave it a little bit more time. There are more advanced protocols like Paul Stamets, who's a pretty famous mycologist. His microdosing protocol is microdose 4 straight days and then take 3 days off. But I think for more beginners, so to say, it's better just to like microdose every other day for at least a month, and then sort of from there you can move around with it as you want. And then the main benefits of microdosing, I think a lot of the emotional benefits are similar to meditation. So staying centered, staying quiet, being able to tap back in, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are also some additional physical benefits where psychedelics are anti-inflammatory. So they're very healthy with the gut, and psychedelics help to facilitate more and more neuroplasticity. So they can help with just creating new neuronal connections. So I think those are really the two main benefits are emotional centering, stillness, quiet, and then physically they help with reducing chronic inflammation and facilitating more kind of neuronal connections in the brain.
Yeah, brilliant. And yeah, of course, there are 2 other brilliant access points to talking about it, of course, as well. Just no-brainers about, well, yeah, all-brainers. And of course, recommend totally checking out the guides on Third Wave's website. We'll put everything in the show notes. And the Becoming Superhuman course. Who are your, at the moment, you mentioned a couple of books you're reading, but who are your go-to guides or reads on microdosing specifically?
There was a woman, Eilette Waldman, who published a book called A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. That was early 2017. She was like a middle-aged mother who had been on pharmaceuticals for a long time and then microdosed with LSD, and it was super helpful for her. Jim Fadiman was, he's sort of the OG of microdosing. He was the one on the Tim Ferriss podcast that I heard back in the day, and he published a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide in 2011. A chapter on microdosing that helped to kick microdosing off. And then I have a book about microdosing that's on Amazon about sort of a more practical guide for people who want to have a really good sort of lens through which to view microdosing. And I would say more generally, like the other reads to be aware of when it comes to like the psychedelic space, the other book that I like to recommend too. One is Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. It's phenomenal. And then there's a woman named Françoise Borzat who published a book called Consciousness Medicine, which is all about how to guide the psychedelic experiences, both prepare the experience itself and help people integrate them. And I think those are probably the best 4 resources: Eilette Waldman, Jim Fadiman, Michael Pollan, and Françoise Borzat, for those who want to go deeper into this medicine and this space and what's going on right now, both microdosing and higher doses as well.
I'll put all of those in the show notes, of course. We could just go on and on and on.
We could go on and on now.
But yeah, I suppose any parting invitations to, I suppose for me, what's coming up is just the importance of integration and surrounding ourselves with people. I mean, this is for me what has felt incredibly crucial is surrounding myself with people who I can have these conversations with, who I can speak about the nuances of my experiences, whether it was microdosing or whether it was a higher dose ceremony. And it just felt absolutely crucial in my own development, integrated into my life, so that it doesn't become, I've had a couple of quite dark experiences, and it just totally does not help when you can't talk about your dark experiences, or you can't talk about any of your experiences. It becomes quite re-traumatizing in many ways. And so the importance of finding people where you can feel safe in your explorations and in your evolving consciousness. It's just what's coming out for me as a real invitation. And I suppose just, and I felt to note maybe in the beginning of our conversation, but just to acknowledge the absolute sacredness of the medicines, and to really, not as a disclaimer, but an invitation for anyone really going down this journey to really be in reverent relationship with the medicines, and maybe create ritual, take a moment to really sit with the power, the gift, and to maybe just acknowledge the lineage. Is there anything else you feel to say or to offer or invite to those listening in who may already be on this journey, or just really at the gates?
Just remember that these are amplifiers of what's already within us, and that they often help us to expand awareness and like come into awareness about these parts of ourselves that we hadn't seen or that we weren't aware of. But that the path ultimately is to show up in a non-psychedelic state, and it's to show up even when things aren't so good. And it's to realize that like these medicines are incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful, and they're only tools. And that the like, just like you wouldn't give your power away to a guru or a religion, you don't want to give your power away to these medicines. They're useful. They can illuminate, and everything that someone needs is already within them. So I think just keeping that in mind is a super powerful place to come from.
Yeah, it reminds me of a teacher of mine always says that the purpose of yoga is to give a better hug.
I like that.
Which I love. Rooted here in the body on this earth in this time. Not really trying to go anywhere. Going somewhere, but bringing it back.
Always.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for showing up in your velour hoodie. I feel like that added something quite special to our exchange.
It did. It did. It feels so nice. I'm glad you brought my attention to it. Thank you for that.
Yeah. It just reminded me of mine as well. This is not velour. It's flannel. But yeah, I feel like we're both just... And I feel both of our voices are a nice, like lukewarm. I feel like we're both just sitting around the fire and having... So good.
I like that.
Where is it best for people to connect with you, Paul?
So the thirdwave.co is a great starting point. That's our website. And then paulaustin.co is my personal website. And then I'm on social at paulaustin3w. So Instagram, Twitter, those are the two main places that I hang out on the socials. And then if any listeners have questions or want to follow up about anything, I would encourage them to reach out over social or email or however they want to.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again. Here's to more conversations, and here's to all of us finding a way to, I suppose to welcome the more than human into our deeply human lives, bridging worlds and making the invisible visible with every step.
Honoring the space between.
You got it. All right.
Thank you, Al.
What questions are still whirring inside for you? What landed and rung loudly for you? Let's take a moment. Thank you for joining me for another life-affirming and enriching conversation, each one a light, a torch to guide us on our path to being in right relationship with ourselves, those we walk with, and the ecologies we are very much a part of. I trust this has gifted you something to place in your toolkit to support you in your journey and your leadership. Make sure to connect with me and leave any comments on my Facebook or Instagram page at ljeffrey, and check out the links in the show notes. This show is completely funded by listeners just like you, so if you feel generous and wish to be part of nourishing these inquiries that we're exploring together, you can leave a once-off donation or soon subscribe to my Patreon membership. Show notes, resources, and donations are all at www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, we can't rush our way back. Notice connections and tend to the sweet, sweet spaces between. Lots of love.